This is a joint meeting of the New South Wales Section and IMRS ACT New South Wales branch, and I thank them for taking it on. You'll see later on that I hope we have a lot of feedback from this presentation that we can feed into the institution's London Council. The presentation is based on a job that I was given by the London Council back in May on the roles and capabilities of naval architects, but the name are naval architects more than just designers sounds a bit sexier, so we've run them with that as a title for this presentation. The group constituted a number of members of the council and one or two others who expressed an interest both within Australia and internationally. The group reported to the council meeting a couple of months ago, and while its recommendations which are fairly general, were adopted in principle by that October meeting, they will be considered further in January. You will see when we get to the recommendations that they are rather general, and what the council needs to do at the January meeting is decide on what specific action should be taken. There's a particular Australian involvement in this particular subject, in that it was raised by our division president at the London Council, and I landed the job of leading the working group. So it does contain a lot of Australian content, and some of the content may not necessarily be relevant to all countries or all sections of industry. Our new Chief Executive, Chris Boyd, I think was going to attend. I don't know if you've got him there on your list, Phil, but if Chris is there and is able to present himself, it would be a good opportunity for you to see what Chris looks like, and he, together with the council, is faced with the implementation of the recommendations or any specific actions that arise from those recommendations. Is Chris there, Phil?
He is there, Rob. I'll just unmute him.
And Rob, thank you very much for inviting me to the technical meeting today. I'll just give a brief introduction to everyone, because I'm Chris Boyd, and been Chief Executive since the 1st of November. And quite importantly, I've been working with Rob and the council, looking at the roles and capabilities of the naval architect, and how we add value to the whole process of our maritime industry. And this is quite important and fundamental work, which the working group has looked at over I think, Rob, as you said, the period of the last year. But certainly I'm tasked with the implementation of recommendations. So this is quite an important and fundamental piece of work, in which really looking forward to the technical presentation, but also the feedback from the technical committee here, so that we can look at the implementation of the recommendations and move forward within how we represent naval architects, from seasoned professionals all the way down to youngsters who are very keen to look at a career within the maritime sector. So I thank you very much for your kind invitation, and thanks, Rob, and I look forward to the rest of the presentation and engaging with the council in New South Wales. And I'm actually calling, funny enough, from South Wales, the other side of the country at the moment, so we've got that connection.
Okay, thanks very much, Chris. What my presentation will, we've already been through the introduction. We've got a problem in defining our profession, and I'll talk a bit about that. The naval architect name itself is not necessarily optimal in terms of representing what we do. We'll talk about that. We'll talk about how to represent ourselves to the world, and whether the problem in being more than just designers is one of naval architect self-identity. We'll then look at the roles and capabilities of naval architects as seen by the three sectors: industry, employers, and public. As we go through the presentation, you'll see that it's not possible to talk about this without turning up stones that are way outside the working group's terms of reference. So we'll talk about those. Then I will list reasonably fully the recommendations for council action, and hopefully we'll move on to questions. The naval architect's definition and naval architecture definition. Phil has had one up on his wall for many years, saying that naval architecture is the art of modelling materials we don't wholly understand into shapes we can't precisely analyse so as to withstand forces we can't properly assess in such a way that the public at large has no reason to suspect the extent of our ignorance. Well, this was actually said in relation to structural engineers by A.R. Dykes when he was head of the Institution of Structural Engineers, but Phil has appropriately adapted it to our profession. I think that probably a more accurate and certainly more academically correct definition of naval architecture is that by the US Naval Academy in Annapolis, Maryland, of it being the field of engineering, which addresses how we can apply our acquired wealth of knowledge to conceive of, design, test, build and operate all types of ships and boats, recreational to naval, small to big, operating on or under the sea, sails to nuclear, and so on. But having said that, the report contains a 7-page annex of what lots of people, various ideas people have had of appropriate definitions. For the purpose of the report, we adopted a definition that it's the branch of engineering that brings together the results of the practical and scientific experience of all those concerned with the design and operation of ships and marine structures, and goes on to say that it includes the naval, commercial, recreational and offshore industry sectors. We talk about naval architect as including those who identify as maritime engineers under our branch of engineering, rather than strictly relating to the shape or layout of a ship or marine structure. Well, I mentioned earlier the name. We've probably all had the question raised of us, well, what's so special about buildings in the Navy that they need their own profession? An alternative name, which has been pushed within the working group, or to the working group by Professor David Andrews of UCL, was system architect. This concentrates fairly well on the role in configuring the ship and the systems, etc., and integrating all of the shapes, spaces, and systems into a finished product. But of course, it doesn't refer to engineering, doesn't cover the maritime connection. Maritime engineer, we've mentioned already. It may be too close to the profession of our colleagues at IMRS, or those of them who are marine engineers. So we would have the problem then of defining the difference between a maritime engineer and a marine engineer. But we have problems if we were to change from the nomenclature or the name naval architect. If we are no longer naval architects, then RINA could no longer be the Royal Institution of Naval Architects and have the same members. So we'd have to change the name of the institution, and in doing so, we would lose the institution's long and prestigious history. It may prejudice our incorporation through Royal Charter, which some of us value, some of us, some Republicans might not value it so much, but it does represent our tradition, and our tradition is of a long and proud profession. And finally, changing was not within the remit of the working group. So we're not going to play with the name naval architect for the purpose of this exercise, and the working group proceeded accordingly. Sometimes, and New South Wales section is in this situation. We have presentations, particularly video presentations, where we don't have control of the system, where the presentation is actually recorded. We need to make sure that it is labelled as a RINA presentation. Sorry, Chris, RINA presentation. And people who come in from wherever to view it may not know that RINA is involved as the professional society for the engineering of ships and marine platforms, or similar. So the group suggested that particularly for virtual presentations and recorded presentations, that we have some such branding, and this is under review. It's one of the things that Chris is looking at. It's not necessarily what you see on your screen there, but that was something that I dreamt up and made it into the working group report. Whether it's adopted, who knows? It was an idea that needed to be put forward. Now, in putting the word platforms into that logo, it was also rather contentious, because many of us say ships are ships and they're not platforms. But the problem there is we needed to cover the offshore industry, where we're not really talking about ships, we're talking about platforms. And in the process of including it in that particular proposal, we can accept the understanding from those, particularly in the naval world, who want to see ships as platforms. Okay, we'll talk about platforms, they're marine platforms, and they're our province. I mentioned the self-identity of a naval architect. The working group looked at whether we are attracting the right students into naval architecture, and the answer generally was yes. We can't control who applies to join our profession, but we have some very well attuned minds in our profession, and generally speaking, the group felt that we are attracting the right students. We don't want to get away from the fact that the fundamental skills of a naval architect are in ship design, but some naval architects do feel constrained in expanding into other areas, related areas, such as environmental protection, project management, production planning, survey certification, operations, sustainment, etc. We couldn't, within the working group, look at whether our people are actually applying for those jobs and not getting jobs in those related areas. But certainly many of us have had careers that go way beyond the design area. But what happens in our training as naval architects with that fundamental skill in design is that we should end up with a good understanding of the total engineering of the ship to enable naval architects to take over those non-design roles that I've outlined. A naval architect doesn't necessarily have to have a degree in naval architecture. We in Australia have a number of people who have degrees in other areas. I could name one electrical engineer, for example, who was a member of the institution because his work is in the marine area and he is able to make a meaningful contribution to the development of the engineering of ships. We have to note that while we have some influence on the syllabus of naval architecture courses, we are not an education provider and we can't run courses for individuals to operate in this area, but the working group suggested that some sort of recognition of courses or listing of courses on the website to make them available to prospective members in particular may be appropriate in terms of broadening the background of individual members. Looking at how the world sees us, the world has changed a lot since I joined the industry, where people started on a drawing board and maybe ended up in technical management or general management or whatever. That doesn't seem to happen anymore. Companies or organizations are run largely by entrepreneurs. But we see a lot of people running organizations in ship design and shipbuilding where they really have a background that is a very small part of shipbuilding and ships in general. So from the outset and the raising of this question in the council, it was brought up apparently to reflect well, I won't say it's a fact, but the impression that industry seems to see little importance in the fundamental skills other than design that apply to the two shipbuilding processes. And later on in the presentation, I'll talk about specific design modifications that need to be made to a bought-in design, but which require the naval architect's expertise to bring the finished product together. The naval architect's role as integrator of technologies, being responsible for the whole package as a working marine vehicle, appears to have been progressively overlooked, as has been the naval architect's broad engineering understanding of the technologies in a ship and its construction that apply to those non-design areas. Well, employers of naval architects or prospective employers of naval architects are part of industry. So the points on the preceding slide apply. First of all, some employers have over the years seen us as costs that don't necessarily add value. The specific work on an existing design that needs to be done before a different designer, a different builder can assemble it, including optimizing structural components and materials that are available, adapting the arrangements to meet technical or cultural requirements, the normal monitoring of as-built characteristics to make sure it's going together properly and will perform properly, such as instability and strength, developing and incorporating improvements so that we can actually get better as we go into get a better product as we go to the later ships in a series. We probably as an institution need to recognize or bring to the attention of employers the continuum of skills available through Reiner's membership, which range from Eng Tech level through to chartered engineer level, and similarly they cover detailed design through to senior management. The roles and capabilities as seen by the public is something that I see in trying to, from time to time, get the ear of politicians about getting appropriate naval architecture inputs into aspects of our industry. Going back to the problem with the name naval architect, the public doesn't necessarily associate our name with engineering ships and marine platforms. Professional engineers sometimes in the minds of the public are no different from your motor mechanics, washing machine technicians, and so on. So the entire engineering profession probably has a PR job to do in making the public aware of what we do in our profession and the technical inputs that we put into it. So our profession, the institution, and the roles and capabilities of naval architects need to have their public profiles raised. There was another point that was raised in that to raise our profile, we've got to participate with industry and with government and with dialogues on common issues. In doing so, it makes us not only more visible, but it makes us more involved. I expect that our membership would see that involvement providing more influence to society generally, provide more value to our members, and so have an effect in adding or retaining our membership. There were a series, some of which I've mentioned before, of topics that the working group couldn't look at. And as I go through them, you'll see that if we could be here for many years if we were to try and do them, handle them all or consider them all in a single hit, such as through this 6-month working group. Education, we couldn't look at syllabi, but there was a feeling that we needed to look at the non-design aspects of naval architecture education. I've mentioned earlier the name Naval Architect and the name of the institution. It's certainly well beyond the working group's remit to look at that. There was a suggestion within the working group that we should involve professional branding and PR services to improve the public relations of the institution. This, of course, involves contractors. Contractors cost money. Money may not necessarily be in our budget, and we have to balance the budget somehow. So it too is well beyond the pay grade of the working group. I mentioned earlier about endorsement of courses to enable students or prospective naval architects to get a toehold in the profession. There's probably work to be done on the course list, which is somewhat hidden away on the website. If you try looking for it, I finally found it sometime after we completed the working group report. It probably needs to be made more prominent. One member of the working group raised the question of professional certification to practice, such as we have in Queensland through the RPEQ certification. Once again, this is not within the coverage of the working group. It's really within national law to require professional certification. But of course, we have chartered membership in our institution, and that would be is the basis of existing professional certification, and would be the basis, but we can't make it legal everywhere. I've mentioned information on how to become a naval architect in terms of the courses. That probably needs to be made more prominent, but this is another area to be looked at by the council in following up on our working group report. I mentioned in relation to the first dot point on this slide, broadening graduates' understanding of ship and shipbuilding technologies beyond design, and that is under the purview of the professional review committee. And another spin-off question that was raised was improving student and career mentoring and support. And those are all topics which we've raised in the report, but we couldn't, as a working group, look at them. And they're there for council to review and look at as it seems fit. So now we come on to the recommendations of the working group. And there are a lot of them, including the I haven't counted them personally, but including the sub-recommendations. There are a total of 27 of them, so they'll take a number of slides. We need to promote ourselves at every opportunity as a professional body, promoting the proper and full application of knowledge in the maritime area, as stated in the objects of the institution. We need to raise the public profile of our profession and the fact that we are not just designers. In doing so, and noting that we don't have, The problem of image of our profession in general is not one simply for our institution, noting that we are about 1% of the size of Engineers Australia. As an example, it's probably a problem for engineers in general, and so we've said in the recommendations that we should work with the Engineering Council, Engineering UK, Engineers Australia and other peak bodies to work on the image of professional engineers. One thing which I mentioned earlier on was that we need to work with industry to emphasize the role of the naval architect as integrator of technologies into a working marine vehicle. As I said earlier, the design is one thing, but it involves a general knowledge of ships and what goes into them and how they work. So design is not the be all and end all of a naval architect's work. The next one is is probably fairly specific to Australia, because our Navy has been of the habit of buying overseas designs, building them in Australia, and then wondering why we have no naval design capacity here in Australia. And the National Shipbuilding Plan has an education component to it through the Naval Shipbuilding College, which involves educating people at all levels, from trades through to PhD levels. And I understand that the plan somehow thinks that by generating PhDs, it will suddenly have a design capacity for naval vessels that is indigenous to Australia. I think that needs to be built up, and it's not going to be done by purely academic reasons or means, and that the bought-in designs that we have need to be worked on by naval architects to ensure that the bought-in design actually results in a fit-for-purpose product that includes those 4 points which I mentioned earlier. Internally, as far as membership is concerned, we've got recommendation 6. In some of these longer recommendations with lots of sub-recommendations, I have, in making up the slide, well, I've abbreviated the text that's actually in the sub-recommendation. I can't recall that, but I've tried to convey the meaning of the sub-recommendation to increase the breadth of membership through visibility and encouraging members to join in roles such as those listed there: environment protection, project management, production planning, production management, as well as project management, etc. We have a couple of courses here in Australia, which are postgraduate courses in naval architecture for graduates in other areas of engineering. Those currently don't have any accreditation. They don't need any accreditation because they generally require someone to have an engineering degree before they actually start the course. But we need to encourage people to go into them. Those two courses in Australia are at AMC and the University of Adelaide. We need to encourage students to join and stay joined and participate in the institution's activities, even if they're well, from offshore engineering in particular. We probably have most of the naval architecture students in Australia coming directly into our student membership, but we've got to work on that. What we don't have is the next dot point, which is lots of senior managers in major shipping and shipbuilding organisations who are certainly not naval architects, and some of us may question how much they know about shipbuilding and the base business of the organisations they head. In some countries, there are a lot of naval architects who are naval officers. This is a non-Australian element to the recommendations. Of course, we have had naval architects who are fellows of our institution who have risen to flag officer level. And we need to encourage those who go through that course, and particularly those who graduate from the new UNSW Canberra Naval Architecture course, who may work as naval officers, to join our institution and remain in our institution. With regard to papers, we need to encourage and publish papers on technical aspects of naval ships. Now, this is a particular problem because most of them have got a lot of secrecy about them, and people can't talk about them. But it's an area that we need to work on. There was one suggestion that came up within the working group that we should develop colleges similar to those of medical practitioners to signify competency in particular areas of the broader profession of naval architecture. But for reasons of cost and complexity of resourcing and administering colleges within an institution such as ours, the group did not recommend going down that track. So this one, recommendation 7, is a non-recommendation. Fundamentally, we need to be able to demonstrate value to our members, including those who are not necessarily qualified in naval architecture, and to employers. So we not only get them recognising us as preeminent in our field, but so preeminent that we are worthy of them paying membership fees, or their employers paying membership fees, and sponsoring events. We're in a particular situation now with COVID. There's a number of risks and opportunities that need to be addressed. We in Australia generally have section meetings which are virtual. How long we'll have to keep that going is not known, but it's going to be a problem for us organisationally when we have to move back to hybrid meetings rather than virtual meetings. But virtual technical meetings give us a lot of flexibility in how we can run our meetings. If you know of if a committee has contact with an appropriate person on the other side of the world or in the other hemisphere, in the northern hemisphere somewhere, they can arrange a presentation from them. And similarly, the participants can meet virtually. So this may improve the availability and quality of technical presentations and improve our visibility. And going along with that is the practice that we have had between section secretaries here in Australia, bearing in mind that this is, of course, a headquarters document or an institution council document. Sections need to look beyond their particular section as far as presentation is concerned, and with virtual meetings, they should publicize in nearby time zones to get the maximum effect of the presentation. Now, this has a downside as far as ourselves here in Australia are concerned, in that we have had a number of technical presentations that have been shown in one section and repeated in another. So it may have a downside in terms of thinning out some sections programs, but the overall effect of the quality and quantity of presentations should be to improve them. Talk in the second last dot point there about branding, and there has been a problem from time to time with the number and capacity of channels required for our meetings. At the moment, I think we have 2 YouTube channels, but we have had occasions where one meeting has had to stop here in Australia because there's been another meeting starting in the UK. So that deals with all of the recommendations of the working group. So I'd now invite your questions.
Okay, well, before I open up the chat line, perhaps I could make a couple of comments, Rob, that occurred to me on the way through. The first one was about the term naval architect. And I do recall many moons ago when I think Noel Riley was president of the Australian division, we had a look at the term naval architect. And for many of the same reasons that you have come up with now, we decided that it was pointless trying to change it, mainly because the term naval architect was so widely accepted throughout the industry. That is the design, construction and operation industries. The other one, or another one, is, are we attracting the right students to naval architecture? And my reply to that would be, as an academic, would be yes, we are, because most of the students that come to university to do or to UNSW Sydney knew that they wanted to be naval architects, and we had very few transfers either into or out of the naval architecture degree program. As far as encouraging students to join the institution, at UNSW Sydney, we had a practice that if you were enrolled in the naval architecture degree program, then you automatically became a member of RINA, and I would each year forward to Trevor Blakely as the chief executive the names of all the students still currently enrolled in naval architecture. And maybe Warren Smith at UNSW Canberra can continue a similar sort of practice. The final point I would make about, you said for now that the section presentations should continue as virtual presentations. I've been in conversation with Engineers Australia and the Sydney Mechanics School of Arts, And both of those are back in operation with up to 50 attendees at a live presentation. And for the moment, I'm expecting that when we get back into operation with technical meetings in February next year, we will be able to have up to 50 people at a face-to-face meeting. But I also expect to be able to stream live and to record the presentations for putting up on the YouTube channel. But having said that, I would say that we have already organised one Zoom presentation from, I say Zoom, I mean a video conference presentation from a presenter in New Zealand for May next year. So that's those are my comments. Now I'll try and open up the chat line and see where we go from there, starting at the top. From Isan Khaled, buying naval designs from outside makes it harder to incorporate Australian businesses in production as well as maintenance phase of naval platforms.
I can only agree, but I'm not really looking at the business side of things as far as componentry is concerned. I'm more looking at our role as a professional society in ensuring that the appropriate naval architecture inputs are put into the design and construction of ships here in Australia. And that's really what I've been talking about rather than equipment supply lines.
Okay, thanks, Rob. Yuri Drobashevsky says, thank you for an interesting presentation. I appreciate that this may be a point for discussion rather than a clear question. What is your view on the relationship between the public or employer's perception of naval architects and the size and level of activity in the civil maritime industry?
I think Yuri's probably in a better position to answer that than I am, quite frankly. I should say that Yuri did provide input to the working group, which was particularly valuable from given his background in the offshore industry in WA in particular. And he was of the view, and this went into the report, that the problems that we're talking about here in the working group report are largely not found within the offshore industry.
Right, okay. Thank you, Rob. Martin Grimm says that he agrees with Isan's view. We once had more firm Australian industry involvement requirements for naval ship and sub building projects, also aircraft building for the RAAF. This seems to have diminished over the years, no hard and fast levels of Australian content, so it leaves it up to the primes to decide. Happy to be corrected if my view is incorrect.
Yes and no. I've been approached in the past few days in relation to an issue that's coming up on the replacement of the Bass Strait ferries. And I can't quite remember Martin's question, but basically we can't say we will go for Australian build regardless. In that,
sorry, Rob, if I'm happy to sort of, it was actually more just a response to Isan agreeing with him. And, you know, like years ago in defence, we did seem to, you know, and it was a government decision ultimately, not public servants, but we just used to specify more hard and fast Australian industry content requirement. It's just something that seems to have waned over the years. So if we want Australian industry content, my view is just the government's got to say it and it's got to mandate it, and then it's up to the primes to achieve that. And I'm certainly conscious of your Bass Strait ferry example. It's the dead reverse, where we're saying, well, we're not going to let an offshore company, build ferries. We want that to be built locally, which is probably not an ideal situation either. It should be an open competition. But yeah, so it was more a comment back to Esan than a question.
Well, what I'm saying there with the Bass Strait ferry situation is it really has to be horses for courses, and if the Bass Strait ferries are to remain conventional ferries rather than high-speed craft, with the customer package that involves and so on, I think the complexity of building a modern passenger ferry is so far away from the experience of the Australian shipbuilding industry in anything other than a high-speed craft that it's bound to be a problem and bound to be very, very, very expensive. So it's got to be horses for courses. But I take your point in terms of being a buyer's requirement that it be built in Australia. If that's the choice, then so be it.
Okay, Martin Reynoldson says, very interesting presentation. So we'll take that just as a comment. Kim Clarker says, we need to decide amongst ourselves what we are and do before explaining it to others. For example, which of the following disciplines or positions are a subset of naval architecture and which are separate from naval architecture? Marine engineer, offshore engineer, ocean engineer, hydrodynamicist, deck officer, and tug operator.
I think Kim was involved in the exercise that we did here in the division over a decade ago, and it still remains in place today to determine a set of supposedly competencies for someone to be listed in the naval architecture area of practice on the National Engineering Register. And the decision that we came to at that time was that we couldn't define definitively, probably. No, there was no set area that we could say this is ours and nobody else's and whatever. We have lots of members operating in lots of different areas, and if you take them all together, and the individuals don't have to be competent in all of them, you can be part of naval architecture, but it's not exclusive, and it's not something that defines naval architecture. It's more where people who identify themselves as naval architects may actually reside in terms of their speciality. I should say that Engineers Australia list was one of the annexes to our working group report.
Okay. Martin Reynoldson says, I think that the group seems to have done a wide-ranging study beyond just the definition of naval architects. I don't know if you need to comment on that, Rob.
Well, what we're doing is, I take you back to the heading of the presentation. Are naval architects more than just designers? The answer is definitively yes.
Yeah.
And they are operating in, and they should be operating in, all of these other areas that involve the understanding of what goes into a good working marine vessel from an engineering perspective.
Yuri says, with respect to education, In the past, IMAR-EST were actively involved in accreditation of maritime engineering courses, at least in some international universities. In Australia, this is done by Engineers Australia. Is the RINA undertaking accreditation of naval architecture university courses, or is it involved in it at all in the UK or in other countries?
The answer is, well, twofold. I'll take the UK side of things first. Yes, we are involved in accrediting courses. In Australia, we have an agreement with Engineers Australia whereby we provide a subject matter expert into accreditation panels. This is necessary, for example, in the case of UNSW Sydney last time the accreditation happened. I think there were 32 BE courses that were part of the accreditation, only one of which was naval architecture. So while we had that subject matter expert in there, the accreditation had to be uniform right across all of those courses, and it's natural that it be run by Engineers Australia. So that's the arrangement we have come to with Engineers Australia, that we will provide that subject matter expert for Australian courses. There may be requirements from time to time in other countries in our region for the institution to accredit courses. I think there have been at recent council meetings that I've attended, but the arrangement that we have in place is for it to be run by Engineers Australia and for us to provide the subject matter expert.
Martin Reynoldson says, issues include issues in different countries, both those speaking English and those who don't speak English.
The working group had people from various countries. It was largely a matter of who from the institutions council wanted to put their hand up to participate in the working group. But there were a lot of people on the working group who were from not primarily English speaking countries, even if their English was very good and we could conduct the business of the working group in English.
Okay. Martin Grimm says, I am curious as to whether RINA has any sort of database on its membership makeup. For example, the nature of their employment, private sector or public sector, defence, shipbuilding, civil operations, etc., or skills that they consider that they have, for example.
I don't know what is happening with this, but my recollection from last time I went in there and from the setting up of the MyRhino database was that a lot of the areas that Martin mentions are actually provided for in the database. I think a lot of the problems is in the use of that database, in that members don't fill in areas that we're interested in. Last time we, as a council, reviewed the technical committees, one of the things that we did was work on that database to try and get people to nominate areas that they're interested in and may be called upon to provide expertise into without actually having to be part of the standing committee. To my knowledge, that hasn't worked. The framework is there within the MyRhino database, but where we go from here is probably part of the I hesitate to say digital review because I'm looking at Chris's face and he's a little bit worried about it, but the digital review which is going on, which is a big part of what Chris faces in the months ahead.
Rob, if I
Okay.
can, I'll just say why I asked that question. I guess you did this review, but it would be nice to inform that review to understand, well, what is the membership makeup of RINA, and who comes to RINA, and therefore what is RINA in terms of how the members are distributed. And certainly my memory was, while I was a SNAMI member years ago, that they did sort of almost ask that on a yearly basis when you paid your membership. So it was a hard copy. I've got to be honest and say I was ignorant that I can go onto my RINA and fill it in. But if everyone is, then it serves little purpose. But yeah, certainly SNAMI used to ask those sort of questions on an annual basis. How they used it, I don't know.
Thanks, Martin. I can't add to what I said previously on that.
Okay, Martin Reynoldson says, civil engineers use the term maritime engineer to mean those designing civil structures such as breakwaters, etc. I agree that we need to get back to face-to-face technical meetings when we can. A big thing that came out of the survey we did a while ago was the importance of networking at the technical meetings. Losing the term royal would help to make us international. Everybody assumes that the organisation is UK based because of the royal in the name. Surely it is not our role to lobby for construction in one country or another.
It's not our role, and we don't lobby for construction in one country or another. As I said, I see our role as being to where we inject ourselves into the public arena is to promote the proper implementation of the skills of naval architects into projects, whether those projects are, well, we're generally talking about projects here in Australia, but they don't have to be here in Australia. But if they are Australian projects and they're not being managed properly, and an example of that was the previous project-based contracting of naval new building programs, which resulted in big lumps and valleys in terms of manpower requirements as projects cranked up and then wound down with the skills developed through those programs dissipated. That's an example where the technical resources aren't being used properly, and it's appropriate for us. It was appropriate then, and I would still say it's appropriate today for us to take a stand on those sorts of issues.
Isan Khaled says, future naval platform programs are managed by overseas companies. As the design is mostly done, the scope of working as a conventional naval architect is slim. I know Australian policy is to ensure that Australian businesses are involved in these programs. Don't you think it is also important to ensure that Australian naval architects are also involved in the design phase? Also, how RINA Australian Division can work with Naval Group, BAE Systems, Lursen, etc., to make sure that naval architects have the scope to work in these projects?
Can only agree, but it takes two to talk. And a lot of the time we are not getting any response to our attempts to talk to some of the companies that were mentioned in that question.
Okay, Warren Smith says, if the issue is a naval architect more than a designer? The answer is yes. But the question asks, what is connotated as design? Everyone has a role in influencing design, but does not wear the label designer. Those that write specifications influence design. Those that make suggestions for changes influence and contribute to design. However, at the undergraduate level, a design perspective is a great way to understand the total package. We at UNSW Canberra will follow the
I think I've lost you, Phil. For the sake of everyone else, when we started this call, Phil was getting messages that his internet was unstable, and it's lasted pretty well up till now. But you're back there, Phil. We lost you there for a minute.
Would you like me to repeat the question or the comment?
Yes, please.
Warren Smith says, if the issue is a naval architect, if the issue is a naval architect more than a designer, the answer is yes. But the question asks, what is connotated as design? Everyone has a role in influencing design, but does not necessarily wear the label designer. Those that write specifications influence design. Those that make suggestions for changes influence and contribute to design. However, at the undergraduate level, a design perspective is a great way to understand the total package. We at UNSW Canberra will follow the UNSW Sydney practice of encouraging student membership of RINA.
Can only agree with everything that Warren said.
That one's very easy. Kim Clarker says, if I am a shipbuilder, what would convince me to employ naval architects rather than marine engineers or mechanical engineers? Surely RINA has a valuable role to play in this.
I think that's really what we're trying to get at with this working group, and the recommendations that a lot of our members seem to lob into design jobs at the early stages of their career, and I wouldn't say that I was terribly successful in the early stages of my career as a designer, but the design skills, as I said in the presentation, are applicable to all of these other areas that we think people should be finding employment. And the question is really, why aren't they finding employment, and why aren't they finding advancement in those other areas?
Okay, Warren Smith has another comment. He says, at UNSW Canberra, we aspire to build a world's best practice naval architecture program, but we desire, as does Navy, our distinction to be a grey ship focus. This is in line with the Navy sponsorship of the program. An article published in the Australian Naval Architect, November 2020, pages 37 to 40, provides further background information underpinning the universities and defence's decision. We will be asking RINA and Australia's maritime industry to respond to a survey as we plan our program for the first courses being run in 2022.
I don't know how to respond to that. I think I can just say good. I've certainly read the article. It's in the current ANA, and for those of you who are online who haven't are not aware that it's available, it is up on the website now, and members should get those members who have asked for a hard copy should receive it in the not too distant future.
If I can just step.
Sorry, just as a matter of interest, Rob, I don't remember seeing notification that it's up on the website.
No, you haven't. It's one of the many things on my task list, I'm afraid.
Okay, well, we can get that underway. Martin Reynoldson says he agrees with Kim. And then Martin Reynoldson also says, where are we with the Naval Shipbuilding Institute? Ian was very keen to get us involved, but is this happening? We ought to chase that one up.
I believe that our president is still chasing up Ian Irving, and he seems to be rather elusive. But I do have some information which I got last week of someone who is a stakeholder engagement person within the National Shipbuilding College, and he's someone I've got to chase up.
Okay. Well, that seems to be the end of the questions on the chat line. Does anybody have any further questions? If you have, maybe you can unmute yourself and ask the question.
Warren Smith, I was just going to make a comment around the survey that's alluded to there in my last comment. Yeah, we are keen to pick up on a number of things that Rob has spoken about. How do we ensure that issues about construction and buildability of vessels and some sense of understanding of operations is part of the education process. But I guess fundamentally also you can't do everything in a 4-year undergraduate degree. We spend our lives learning new material, but while we focus initially on the new undergraduate degree in Canberra, we do have visions, of course, for the similar sorts of transition programs or conversion programs that Rob is talking about for taking someone who may have done a mech degree, for example, or aero, and give them a naval architectural foundation through postgraduate coursework. So again, it'd be a case of watch this space. But thanks very much, Rob, for your presentation.
Okay, any further comments or questions? Speak now or forever hold your peace.
Phil?
Yes.
Martin, can I fire one up?
Yep.
This might come across as a bit of a rant. I've sort of retired from defence now, but look, my perception in the last decade or maybe two is that we seem to be quite happy within Navy or defence to sort of acquire ships and do all sorts of things to the combat system, but there seems to have been this real paranoia to do anything on the platform side of things. So yes, it's quite fine to change the UK combat system to an Australian combat system, or an American combat system to an Australian one, less so. But it's almost like you can't touch a single nut or bolt when it comes to the hull itself. And it just seems like this whole understanding of ship being an integrated product where everything's got to be balanced. And if you want to muck around with the combat system, you better make sure you're doing the platform system right. That seems to be lost on a lot of the senior people. And look, I've struggled to understand how we can, better inform our senior people that you've got to have a bit more of an integrated approach to the whole process of naval ship design. Don't just fiddle with one element of it and think the other one's the high risk one. It's probably almost the opposite. So yeah, I guess it's a bit of a rant, but that to me is an example of having to better inform your employer about what the role of a naval architect is. So any comment, Rob, or anyone else?
I think it's an appropriate comment to make, Martin, and I agree. I certainly get the impression from my dealings with you and your colleagues in defence that to some extent naval architects are left in the bilge, quite frankly.
Yep.
And when you have systems like you had, for example, on the AWD, where I don't know what was done in terms of re-examining the damage stability, for example, the AWD, in adapting to the combat system that was put in to that hull. But clearly the combat system, air conditioning and ventilation arrangements did require some fairly significant changes to the arrangement of the ship, and I would hate to think that that was done without re-examining actually the damage stability capabilities of that design. But yes, that I think your intervention sums up really what we're trying to achieve through this working group.
Warren Smith says, are you able to identify who was in the working group?
The working group was comprised of members of council who volunteered to participate in the working group. The two non-members of council who participated were Yuri Drobyshevsky and Professor David Andrews from UCL. I can't nominate which members of council actually were in the working group, but we had a good cross-section of council who put their hands up to participate.
Okay, thanks. I see that I missed one from Jason Stewart. And in answer to Kim's question about I am a shipbuilder, what would convince me to employ a naval architect is first principles, that is stability, structures, etc. Mechanical engineers don't do those first principles.
If you're asking me to comment, I'll take that as a comment from Jason.
Right, okay. Are there any further questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, Patrick White says, did you receive much feedback from younger naval architects on how they identify themselves? As someone with relatively early on in their career, opinions on how we see the future on naval architects may differ.
Thanks for that comment, or question, Patrick. No, we didn't get, obviously, being largely made up of council members, they're largely older naval architects who were in the working group, and so we didn't get much input from younger members, and that's one of the reasons why I've offered this presentation today, to try and get that sort of input from members such as Patrick. So any input that he can provide would be most welcome.
Great. Okay, well, many thanks, Rob, for your presentation. On behalf of RINA, IMR EST, and all the participants this evening.